My brother sent me a text on a Tuesday afternoon that I still have saved on my phone. I've read it probably 100 times since then, not because it hurts anymore, but because it still amazes me how a single message can change everything. It said, "Stay out of my business, Celeste. I don't need your help and I never asked for it. You're suffocating me." I read it sitting in my car in the parking lot of the accounting firm where I work, eating a sandwich I hadn't tasted, and I remember thinking, okay, just okay. And then I drove back inside, sat down at my desk, and spent the next 4 hours making phone calls that would unravel everything my brother had built on my name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think. I grew up in a small city in northern Ontario, the kind of place where winters last 6 months and everyone knows your business before you do. My parents divorced when I was 11, and my brother, Damien, was 8. Our mother stayed in the house and our father moved to a bachelor apartment 2 streets over, which somehow felt worse than if he'd moved across the country close enough to see, but never quite there. My mother worked as a dental receptionist and she did her best. I genuinely believe that. But there was always a feeling in our house that resources were scarce, and that I, being the older one, was somehow responsible for managing that scarcity. If Damien needed new hockey equipment, I babysat neighbors' kids on weekends. If the hydro bill was high, I turned off lights behind everyone and reminded my mother to call and ask about payment plans. I was 11, 12, 13, doing the quiet administrative work of keeping a family afloat while pretending it was normal. Damien noticed none of this. I don't say that with bitterness, I say it as a fact. He was a kid, and then he became a teenager, and the world mostly arranged itself around his needs because that's how our mother loved him. Loudly, completely, with full surrender. She loved me too, but her love for me had expectations baked into it. Her love for Damien was just love, clean and uncomplicated. I left for university in Ottawa when I was 18. I got a partial scholarship and worked part-time at a grocery store to cover the rest. I studied accounting because it made sense, because I'd been doing a version of it my whole life, and because I wanted, more than anything, to understand how money worked so that money could never be used to make me feel small again. I graduated, found a job, moved into a one-bedroom apartment that was mine alone, and started building something steady. By the time I was 26, I had no debt, a small emergency fund, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely secure. Damien, meanwhile, had spent his early 20s drifting, a semester of college, then a move to Calgary, then back to Ontario, then a brief attempt at starting a landscaping company that dissolved over one winter. My mother called me regularly to update me on his situation, and each call had the same structure. A recitation of Damien's latest difficulty, followed by a pause, followed by a gentle suggestion that maybe I could help. I helped. I helped because he was my brother. I helped because I remembered being small in that house, and knowing that money was always the thing that stood between safety and panic. I sent him money when he needed it. Not enormous amounts, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, and he always promised to pay it back and never did. And eventually I stopped expecting repayment and just filed it in my mind under family. When Damien was 28, he told me he had a real plan. He'd met a woman named Priya through mutual friends. They'd been together 2 years, and together they wanted to open a small restaurant, nothing fancy, just a 40-seat breakfast and lunch spot in a mid-sized town outside of Ottawa where commercial rent was more affordable. Priya had hospitality experience. Damien had learned to cook, they had some savings. The problem was the commercial lease. He needed a co-signer. He explained it clearly and calmly, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with a folder of printed documents. The lease was for a ground floor space in a newer commercial building, 3 years with an option to renew. Monthly rent was $2,400. He and Priya had calculated that with their projected revenue, they could cover it comfortably by month 4, and he just needed someone with strong credit and stable employment to sign alongside them for the first year, until they'd established enough of a business track record to refinance under their names alone. I asked questions. I read the documents, I asked more questions. Damien had answers for everything, and Priya, who joined us later that evening, was clear-eyed and specific about their projections in a way that reassured me. I asked a lawyer friend to briefly review the lease language, and she said it looked standard. I co-signed. For the first year, things seemed fine. The restaurant opened in the spring, got some good reviews on local food sites, and Damien sent me photos occasionally the dining room full on a Saturday morning. A new menu item he was proud of, a local newspaper write-up. I visited once, and the food was genuinely good. I let myself feel proud of him. Then Priya left. She and Damien split in the winter of their second year. She had invested her own savings into the business, and she wanted her share back. There were lawyers involved. Damien called me in a state of distress. I hadn't heard from him since we were children, that particular quality of panic that meant the scaffolding was collapsing and someone needed to hold it up. I listened. I sympathized. I asked what he needed. What he needed, it turned out, was a short-term loan to buy out Priya's share so she wouldn't force a closure of the business. He had a number, $18,000. He promised a repayment plan. He had a document drafted by his own lawyer, outlining the terms 12 monthly payments starting 2 months after the buyout was complete. I transferred the $18,000. 12 monthly payments never came. What came instead were excuses, each one more elaborate than the last. The restaurant was slower in the fall. He had a staffing problem. He had a supplier issue. He had a personal situation he wasn't ready to talk about. I stopped asking directly because asking created conflict, and conflict with Damien always ended, with my mother calling me to explain that I was being too hard on him, and he was trying, and didn't I know how much pressure he was under. By the time I was 29, I had co-signed the lease and loaned my brother $18,000 that existed nowhere except in a document I kept in a folder, I kept in a drawer. I was starting to feel embarrassed to open. What I didn't know, and this is the part that I still find difficult to explain without my voice going flat and careful the way it does when I'm managing myself, was that Damien had done something else with my name. He had applied for a small business loan from a local credit union. The application listed me as a guarantor. He had not asked me. He had not told me. He had, at some point, obtained enough of my personal and financial information to submit an application on my behalf, and the credit union, relying on my strong credit profile, had approved a loan of $31,000. I found out on a Wednesday morning in February when I received a letter at my home address, my address, not Damien's, from the credit union, addressed to me, referencing a loan account number I didn't recognize and a missed payment that had triggered an automatic notification to all guarantors. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with that letter. Then I called the credit union. The woman I spoke to was professional and careful. She confirmed the loan, confirmed my name as guarantor, confirmed that a payment had been missed. I explained, very quietly, that I had not authorized this guarantee and had not been informed of this loan. She told me I would need to come in person with identification and make a formal dispute. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Damien. He answered on the third ring with the easy, unhurried voice of someone who doesn't yet know what's coming. I told him I had received a letter from the credit union about a loan I had not agreed to guarantee. There was a long pause. Then he said it was just a formality, that he'd needed a strong guarantor, and he knew I would have said yes if he'd asked, that it was already done, and the loan was almost paid off, and it wasn't a big deal, that I was making this into something it wasn't. I asked him directly, "Did you use my name and personal information without my consent to secure a $31,000 loan?" He said, "I knew you'd react like this. This is exactly why I don't tell you things. You don't trust me. You never just trust me." I said, "Damien, answer the question." He said, "I'm not doing this right now." And he hung up. I put the phone down on the table. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because I think it's important. I did not cry. I did not feel the hot surge of anger I might have expected. What I felt was something quieter and more clarifying, like a fog I hadn't known was there, suddenly lifted, and I could see the whole landscape of the last 4 years with a kind of terrible precision. Every conversation where I'd softened my response because he was under pressure. Every time I'd filed another broken promise under family. Every call from my mother reminding me to be patient with him. I could see all of it at once, and it was very clear. I called my lawyer friend that evening. Not the one who'd reviewed the lease, a different one. Someone who handles financial disputes and whose number I'd saved 2 years ago after a client at work had mentioned her. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "There are several things we can do here. How far do you want to go?" I told her to tell me all of them. The first thing I did was contact the credit union and formally dispute my role as guarantor, submitting a signed affidavit stating that I had not authorized the guarantee and that my personal information had been used without my consent. My lawyer helped me draft it. The credit union opened a fraud investigation and immediately flagged the account. The second thing I did was contact the commercial landlord for Damien's restaurant. This was the part I had thought about most carefully, because I understood what it would mean. As a co-signer on the lease, I had been receiving the annual lease renewal documents for my signature and returning them without scrutiny, because Damien had always told me everything was fine and current. The third and final year of the original lease term was coming up for renewal in 4 months. I notified the landlord in writing that I would not be co-signing the renewal and that I was formally withdrawing from any future obligations beyond the current lease term. I also asked the landlord for a current accounting of the lease status. What I received back was not what I expected. There were 3 months of unpaid rent, totaling $7,200, that Damien had apparently been deferring under an informal agreement with the previous property manager, an agreement that had never been documented and that the current property manager was not prepared to honor. The landlord was prepared to pursue both Damien and me for the outstanding amount. I forwarded this immediately to my lawyer. She sent a formal notice to Damien's lawyer. He had a lawyer, apparently, though not one who'd been advising him especially well, stating that I was disputing liability for the missed payments on the basis that the deferral agreement had not been disclosed to me as co-signer and that I was pursuing recovery of the full amount from Damien directly, plus the original loan of $18,000, plus legal costs. It was around this time that my mother called. She had clearly spoken to Damien. Her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's been crying but doesn't want me to know, slightly thickened, slightly careful. She said she didn't understand what was happening, but that Damien was very upset, and that the restaurant might have to close, and that she needed me to talk to him and work this out as a family. I told her, as gently as I could, that Damien had used my name without my consent to secure a $31,000 loan, that there was unpaid rent on a lease I co-signed that I was now potentially liable for, and that I had loaned him $18,000 2 years ago that he had not repaid. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's been going through a really hard time." I said, "I know. I've been helping him through it for 4 years." She said, "Why do you always have to make everything about money?" I didn't answer that. I told her I loved her, and I'd talk to her soon, and I ended the call. That evening, Damien texted me. It was a long message, and I'll summarize it. He said I had always treated him like a charity case, that I held money over people's heads, that I was punishing him for not being the kind of brother who fit into my perfect, organized life, that he had built something real and I was tearing it down, and that if I followed through with the legal process, I should consider us done. I read the whole message. Then I typed back, "Okay," and I sent it. He sent 4 more messages over the next hour, escalating in tone. I didn't respond to any of them. 3 days later, I received a text from my mother that said, "I need you to understand that what you're doing to your brother is going to damage this family permanently. Please think about that before you keep going." I read it. I put my phone down. I made myself a cup of tea. I thought about what she'd said. I thought about being 13 years old and turning off every light in the house to save money for a hydro bill my mother couldn't cover. I thought about the $18,000 sitting in a drawer in a folder I felt ashamed of. I thought about a credit union letter arriving at my home address for a debt I had never agreed to. I kept going. The credit union's fraud investigation concluded 8 weeks later. They found sufficient evidence that the guarantee application had been submitted using my information without my authorization. They removed me from the loan, flagged Damien's account, and referred the matter to their compliance team for further review. My lawyer told me this did not automatically result in criminal charges but created a formal record that could be used in civil proceedings. We filed a civil claim against Damien for the $18,000 loan, with interest, plus my share of the legal costs related to the lease dispute. The claim was straightforward. I had a signed loan agreement, a record of the transfer, and documented non-payment. The lease situation resolved itself with less drama than I'd expected. The landlord negotiated directly with Damien, who ended up surrendering the space 4 months early in exchange for a release of the arrears. The restaurant closed on a Thursday in late April. I drove past it once, a few weeks after, and saw the windows papered over and a small "for lease" sign in the door. I felt something when I saw it, but it wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't guilt. It was closer to exhaustion, the kind you feel at the end of something that went on much longer than it should have. My mother did not contact me for 2 months after the restaurant closed. When she finally called, it was a Sunday afternoon, and she sounded smaller than I'd ever heard her. She said she was sorry for some of the things she'd said. She said she knew Damien had made mistakes. She said she was scared she was losing both of us. I told her she wasn't losing me. I told her I loved her. I told her I was also not going to pretend the last 4 years had been something other than what they were. She said, "I didn't know about the loan, the one he took out with your name." I said, "I know." She was quiet. Then she said, "That wasn't right." That was the first time she'd said it plainly, without softening it, without immediately following it with a, "but he was under pressure," or a, "you know how he gets." Just, that wasn't right. It wasn't much, and it wasn't everything, but it was something real, and I held on to it. Damien and I have not spoken since the text, where I replied, "Okay." His lawyer contacted my lawyer twice, once to discuss a settlement on the civil claim, which resulted in a payment schedule that he has, to his marginal credit, been following, and once to communicate that he considered our relationship finished, which I had already understood. I'm 31 now. I have my apartment, my job, a savings account that is no longer being quietly drained, and the kind of life I'd been building towards since I was a teenager, calculating hydro bills. Last fall, I took a week off and went to Prince Edward Island alone, and I walked on the beach every morning and ate good food and read 3 novels and did not check my phone until noon each day, and it was the best week I'd had in years. I want to say something for anyone who's sitting with a situation that looks like mine, because I think there are more of those situations out there than people acknowledge. Being the responsible one in a family is not a permanent job. It is a role you were assigned, often without your consent, often very young, and the fact that you've filled it faithfully for years does not mean you are obligated to fill it forever. Reliability is not the same as availability. Having strong credit and a stable income does not make you a financial resource for other people to draw from. The hardest part of what I went through was not the legal process or the money. The hardest part was recognizing that the story I'd told myself about my family, that I was helping, that I was needed, that my contributions were appreciated even if they weren't said out loud, was not entirely accurate. The truer version was that I had been useful to certain people in certain ways, and that usefulness had been so consistently available that it had stopped being something anyone needed to be grateful for. It had just become infrastructure. You are not infrastructure. You are a person, with your own finances and your own future, and your own right to say, "Not this time." There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from family that is unlike any other pressure, because it carries with it the weight of love and history and the fear of loss. When Damien said, "Consider us done," part of me felt that as a wound, because of course it did. He's my brother, and I grew up beside him, and there are things I know about him that I will always carry with tenderness, even now. But I also know that love and accountability are not opposites. You can love someone and still require them to face consequences. You can love someone and still refuse to absorb losses that are not yours. You can love someone and still, quietly and firmly, withdraw your name. When I drove past that papered-over restaurant window, what I was actually seeing was the shape of what happens when one person's choices are allowed to expand indefinitely into another person's resources. The restaurant wasn't my dream. The loan wasn't my debt. The lease wasn't my responsibility to extend indefinitely into the future. I signed my name once in good faith. That was mine to own. Everything that came after it, every additional compromise, every extension of trust past its reasonable limit, that's the part I'm still learning to forgive myself for. Not because I did something wrong, but because I stayed long past the moment I knew. The text that started all of this, "Stay out of my business," Celeste, turned out to be exactly the permission I hadn't known I was waiting for. I was out. I just needed him to say it first. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this story, I want you to hear this clearly. The moment you realize you've been treated as a resource rather than a person is not a moment to be ashamed of. It is a moment to be quiet with, and then to move through, and then to build from. You did not fail because you helped. You grow now by understanding when helping has become something else entirely. Know the difference between support and subsidy. Know the difference between family and obligation. And know that removing your name from something that was never truly yours is not betrayal. It is, finally, just good accounting.